Hello, interweb. This is Mr. Hosking finishing up the 1960s in the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is this bitter battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Not so much a battle in actual fighting, but kind of that brinksmanship idea that we talk about the last video we watched, where they're trying to get to the brink of war so that they can show off or poise themselves to be the bigger and stronger country. In this video, we're going to focus mainly on Cuba. There are going to be two major events that happen in Cuba. The first one is going to be the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1959, Cuba becomes a communist country under the leadership of Fidel Castro. He leads an army revolution against the existing country and makes it a communist nation. They become an ally of the Soviet Union. Communist nations tend to stick together. And so in 1961, the United States is going to back a bunch of Cuban exiles to try and invade Cuba. They were trained by the American forces. There was supposed to be an American Air Force invasion before the Cuban exiles landed, but that never happened. The exiles are going to be shot down by the communists. It's going to be a huge unsuccessful attempt to invade Cuba, and it's quite embarrassing for the United States. It makes us look very, very silly, especially our president at the time, John F. Kennedy. This is going to lead to the next issue between the United States and Cuba and the Soviet Union, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, a United States spy plane flying over Cuba spots some intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're nuclear weapons that are being installed from the Soviet Union. The United States demands that they are removed because we don't want missiles that can reach our shores in that short of a period of time. It becomes really close when the USSR and the United States almost enter a nuclear war. The United States starts blockading Cuba, stopping Russian boats from going through. The Russian boats continue to move closer, and it's probably this and the Berlin crisis are the two closest points the United States and the Soviet Union come to actually fighting in a war. We place a blockade, which is a naval quarantine around Cuba. Here's a picture of from the spy plane of the missiles. And here are the ranges that the missiles can be shot. Medium range ballistic missiles could reach Washington, D.C. within minutes. Long range ballistic missiles could reach almost all of continental United States except for like Seattle.
In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev's hedgehog triggered the gravest confrontation of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships crossed the Atlantic bound for Cuba. They carried military hardware, Soviet troops, and nuclear missiles capable of striking nearly anywhere in the United States. On October 14th, U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba confirmed what for months had been rumored.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Cargoes of offensive weapons returned back.
For Americans, the idea of going to war with the Soviet Union was terrifying, but having nuclear missiles stationed permanently in Cuba was unthinkable.
I'd hate like Jack to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stop Russia from having things their own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Doran, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no?
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The crisis turned critical. U.S. military forces prepared for a possible invasion of Cuba. It was the greatest emergency troop mobilization since World War II. For the first time in its history, the nation's nuclear army, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would mean nuclear war. If a nuclear strike was launched from Cuba, American Minuteman missiles were poised to destroy every major city in the Soviet Union.
Re-entry, arming and fusing.
Just as the flexible response had promised, the president had every military option at his disposal.
Warhead, arming and fusing. Channel set.
As tension mounted, the first opening in the crisis came from Khrushchev. On October 26th, he cabled the president.
Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot, until even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. Let us relax forces, take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this.
As the two leaders fumbled to untie the knot, events they had unleashed threatened to overwhelm them. Castro pleaded with Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike should the U.S. mount an invasion. In Washington, Kennedy was pressed to attack Cuba. Air Force General Curtis LeMay insisted American military forces should surround the island and, if need be, fry it. While the world edged closer to the nuclear abyss, Bobby Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington to seek a negotiated settlement. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. On October 28th, a message was broadcast from Moscow. Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles. The world breathed a sigh of relief.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them.
That's all we need to know about the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, one of the heights of the war, bringing the United States and the Soviet Union almost to the brink, right, to the edge of war, and eventually walked back by both Kennedy and Khrushchev to avoid war. This has been the 1960s in the Cold War. I'm your boy, Mr. Hosking. See you later, cyber web.